This is ThinkEnergy, the podcast that helps you better understand the fast-changing world of energy through conversations with game changers, industry leaders, and influencers. So join me, Dan Séguin, as I explore both traditional and unconventional facets of the energy industry. Hey everyone, welcome back. On today's show, we're going to talk about what's on everyone's mind, net zero. Today's show is going to be a great one, Canada's amazing race to net zero emissions by 2050. The topic of climate change is something all generations, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Zs, acknowledge as urgent and critical for the future of our planet. Now, imagine in the not too distant future where Canada is 100% powered by clean, renewable energy and all vehicles on the roads are electric, producing zero greenhouse gas emissions. So to be clear, net zero will be reached when we remove as much or more greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere than we put into it. And this utopia is not science fiction, but rather an ambitious action plan that Canada aims to achieve by the year 2050. In fact, with less than 3 decades to go, the race is on to achievable targets and solve the greatest challenge of our lifetime. On another piece of information, the Royal Bank of Canada just released a report in October 2021 stating that this transition to net zero emissions could have a price tag of, get this, $2 trillion. That's $60 billion a year. Wow. Right now, we're putting as much pollution into the atmosphere as we did a generation ago, emitting 730 million tons of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases each year. To get back on track, the federal government has committed to getting Canada back to around 500 million tons by 2030. And some of our listeners may not be aware of our very own organization, Hydro Ottawa Holding, just announced its commitment to reach net zero operations by 2030, a first for any municipally owned utility company in Canada. That's pretty amazing. So here's today's big question. Say Canada reduces emissions by 500 million tons by 2030. What is it going to take to eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions between 2030 and 2050? Now, joining us today is Catherine Abreu, the Executive Director of Destination Zero and former Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada. Catherine, I'm hoping you can shed some light on how the general public can sort spin from substance as it relates to net zero conversations that seem to be gaining enormous momentum. Now, Catherine, are you ready to dive into today's questions?
Of course.
The term net zero gets thrown around a lot, but is often misunderstood. Arguably, there's historically been a lot of attention and understanding around one half of the net zero equation, which is lowering our emissions profile. But there's another side to net zero as well, which involves removing or absorbing emissions from the atmosphere. Now, I'm wondering if you can speak to this second part in more details. What does it involve and how important is carbon removal and absorption to net zero efforts, Catherine?
Hey, Daniel. Yeah, thanks for this question. It's a really, really important one. I think often when people hear the phrase net zero by 2050, and we've been hearing it a lot in the last couple of years, especially, it's easy to get really distracted by those phrases net and 2050. And for me, the operating word in that phrase is zero. And so what net zero means is that we are getting as close to zero emissions as possible. That being said, there will be remaining sources of emissions that we're not able to mitigate in time by mid-century. And so we use that term net to talk about building up our capacity to sequester those emissions, either through natural means, which is the preferred choice, by improving our agricultural lands, turning our farms into places that can help capture some of that carbon, by reforming some agricultural practices, restoring natural ecosystems, in particular forests, which of course, requires, number one, for us to protect those forests, make sure they're not being chopped down, and as much as possible protect them from the growing forest fires that we're seeing rage across Canada. Restoring other natural ecosystems like wetlands, which are actually really huge carbon sinks. They store a lot of carbon, and so that's the primary focus for that part of the net is let's restore those natural ecosystems, so that we can sequester more of that carbon in the future, if we're not able to actually bring it down to zero, because some of that carbon is going to be coming from buildings that will still be putting out some of that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the future, and we won't be, we may not necessarily be able to get every single building to zero emissions by 2050. So that's one potential source. Of course, industrial sources are another example. And restoring those natural ecosystems has a whole bunch of other benefits, right? Like it improves our health and well-being to be able to access those natural species, or those natural spaces, I should say. And it helps with species restoration, because of course the twin crises to climate change is the biodiversity crisis. The other side of the net equation is technology. So technology that will actually capture carbon from an industrial process or from the air and turn it into something else, ideally. So carbon capture, utilization, and storage is the phrase that's often used on that front. CCUS is the acronym. And we have some of those technologies in operation right now. Generally, they're operating at extremely small scale in a very niche pilot project area, and they're being helped along by huge government subsidies. These carbon capture technologies are right now quite expensive. And so that's why we often say when we're talking about net zero that while those technologies will likely be a part of our future, particularly in industrial applications, we probably right now need to be focusing on those solutions that we know are going to work and that don't require such huge government subsidies. And those solutions are really in those ecosystem restoration solutions that I was talking about at the outset.
Okay. In your view, Catherine, what are the most promising and impressive carbon reduction and removal technologies from the perspective of maximizing the ability to achieve net zero by 2050? What are you most excited about when it comes to the vision and opportunity of net zero?
So yeah, I'm going to give you an answer that's maybe a bit unexpected, because I think when we imagine technology, we often think about it in very uh, mechanical terms, right? We think about, oh, what's the new flashy, shiny piece of technology that we're going to apply and that will save us from ourselves. I think also as humans, we tend to be very preoccupied with silver bullet solutions. So we're saying, what's the new cool technology that we can invent that's just going to solve climate change for us in the future, and we don't have to worry about it. And so I often get worried in the carbon capture conversation that that's where people's minds go. When in reality, we're looking at a huge mix of solutions. And the technologies that we're going to be working with, some of them will be those, mechanical technologies that we imagine, but many of them will actually be social adaptations, right? So kind of human-based technologies, new ways of doing things. And so to link it back to our earlier conversation about what net zero by 2050 really means, we can think about a different way of approaching agriculture so that farmland is it turned from a carbon source, which it really is right now. It's the third largest source of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions in the world. So we can think about how to turn it from a carbon source into a carbon sink. So how do we innovate in the agricultural sector to improve the those agricultural lands' capacity to sequester carbon. And I would say that that's actually the thing that I feel most excited about, because I think we have huge, largely untapped potential in that arena. And that conversation around agricultural transformation and the role that farmers can play in a net zero future is just picking up steam here in Canada. And I think it's going to be a really, really important one for us in the next decade, because making farmers a part of the solution is also a big and exciting possibility. In terms of those hard technologies, a lot of them, as I was saying earlier, are still relatively undeveloped, and so it's hard to say which one is going to win the day, right? Which one we might be seeing used in some of those industrial applications more often in the future. That's likely to come kind of post 2030. So over the course of the next decade, we'll be really, really focusing on the things that we have at our fingertips right now. But there will be this kind of technological evolution that happens in parallel. And, perhaps by the 2040s and the 2050s, there will be some carbon capture technologies that are widely used or more widely used. And so really, I think what we have to be focusing on is striking this balance between investing in the solutions that we know we have now, that we have right at our fingertips and that we just need to scale up. And then also taking a look at some of the innovation and the evolution that's happening in carbon capture technologies, mostly in the private sector. There are private sector proponents that are thinking through that problem right now. And perhaps, in the next decade, that's a little bit where we'll be pivoting and thinking about how we're using some of those existing solutions at the scale we need to, while also bringing in some of these newer technologies.
Okay. There seems to be a lot of excitement around the GHG reduction potential associated with electrification. What's your vision of the role of clean electricity and electrification of other sectors when it comes to helping to fulfill our country's GHG reduction requirements?
I love this question. I have spent the early part of my career regularly attending utility review board meetings and thinking through integrated resource planning processes for utilities. And so I'm a dedicated electricity nerd, and I think we often don't talk about that as much as we need to in Canada, because we have electricity systems across Canada that are already over 80% non-emitting. And so for us, electricity is maybe a little bit less a part of the climate action conversation than it is in other places that have much more greenhouse gas intensive electricity systems. But of course, that really differs across the country. So, we have pretty GHG intensive electricity systems on the East Coast in Canada, through the prairies. But why we focus in on that is because clean electricity is where it all starts. That's the foundation that we have to build a decarbonized society from. A clean electricity system is what we need to power electric vehicles, whether those are personal vehicles or public transportation vehicles. Clean electricity is what we need to depend on to build our net zero homes, right? You can't have a net zero home if that home is in part using electricity that's being generated from greenhouse gas emitting sources like coal. And so all of these other sectors that we want to decarbonize, even industry, right? Huge potential for electrification in industry, but the only point of electrifying industry is if that electricity is cleaner than the sources of energy that they're using right now. So all of those other sectors need to decarbonize, and the way they're going to decarbonize is by using a clean electricity system. And I think also part of why that conversation is big here in Canada is because we are at the starting point of having a relatively clean electricity system when compared to other jurisdictions. And so here in Canada, we have the potential to, scale up the clean renewable energy that's in our energy mix already. So move from over 80% clean electricity across Canada to closer to 100% clean electricity in Canada. And there are government commitments that put us on that track. We also have the potential to think about scaling up our exports of clean electricity. And I think that's actually an important conversation, because Canada has a very greenhouse gas intensive export economy right now. A lot of our exports, they are fossil fuel intensive, and so they have a really high carbon footprint. And we need to be thinking about how to substitute those high carbon exports with low carbon exports as our economy decarbonizes. And clean electricity is a big potential there. So yeah, so that's really the foundation of the social and economic transformation that we're talking about as we shift from fossil fuel based energy sources to clean renewable energy based sources.
When folks hear about plans for reaching net zero by 2050, their immediate reaction is to be concerned about potential increase in energy cost or perhaps about losing their jobs, depending on the sector they work in. What would you say to these folks, Catherine?
The concern over rising energy costs is a huge one. We've actually seen that rear its head pretty substantially this year in the late half of 2021 with rising energy costs across Europe, relating mostly to the rising costs of gas. And I think actually a big lesson that we're learning from the energy cost crisis that many parts of Europe and other parts of the world are experiencing right now is that the fossil fuel market is actually quite volatile. And that volatility has impacted Canada quite a bit as a major oil and gas producer already. But it's starting to impact not only, production and jobs related to that production of fossil fuels, it's starting to also now penetrate energy systems that rely on those fossil fuels. And so we need to be correcting for that volatility. And a part of how we do that, actually, and this is maybe counterintuitive to a lot of folks because there's a lot of misguiding rhetoric out there around renewable energy. But part of how we make energy systems more resilient is by incorporating more renewable energy, more distributed renewable energy generation into those systems. And then another important piece is energy efficiency. So you make those energy systems really lean as much as you can by cutting energy waste, right? So we want to be making sure that we're not losing energy as it's transferred from where it's created to where it's used. We want to make sure that when it's used as efficiently as possible. And so those investments in energy efficiency help make the energy system more stable. And then when we make that energy system run on renewable energy, and when we're talking renewable energy, we're talking about a mix here of water, wind, sun, and storage, of course. Then we see that there is a new kind of resilience put into that system, because often those energy sources can help us lock in long-term prices that are much more stable than the volatile energy prices associated with fossil fuels. So that is the kind of longer-term solution that we're looking to here. And I said the word distributed earlier. And distributed, so here in Canada and in most parts of North America, we're used to energy generation happening kind of far away from where we live, right? It's like big coal plants, big natural gas plants that are far away from where we live, and we don't really see them operate very often. And there's huge, long transmission lines that get it to our neighborhoods, and then big distribution networks that get it to our homes. With renewable energy, we have the potential to bring that generation closer to where we need it, where we actually need the end product of the energy. And that can really help build more resilient energy systems as well, because the energy doesn't have as far to go. It's closer to where the demand is. And we maybe have, instead of relying on this one source of energy, we have several sources of energy kind of in the neighborhood that we can be turning to. So I think that's the really that's the crux of this kind of transition that we need to be going through. And in the long run, that can really offer much lower and more stable energy prices for people. But unfortunately, we've heard a lot of misguided, or I think intentionally misrepresented rhetoric around renewable energy and it having a high cost. And the only reason that it appears to have a high cost is because fossil fuel energy has been subsidized so heavily for the last century by governments that those fossil fuels tend to have an artificially lower cost. But we're paying for that artificially lower cost as taxpayers. And so part of the equation here is leveling out the playing field between fossil fuels and renewable energy by supporting the growth of renewable energy and stopping subsidies to fossil fuels.
Okay. As a customer-focused company, Hydro Ottawa understands price and affordability sensitivities. What's your view on how we can meet the massive challenge of decarbonization of our energy system without creating hardships for some?
Yeah, there are a lot of models that I think we can learn from around the world. And actually, right here in Canada, there are some really precedent-setting models in provinces across this country to address the concerns around energy affordability while also carrying on with this very necessary energy system transition that we have. Um, so a part of how you do that, number one, I mentioned energy efficiency earlier. You can turn energy efficiency into a tool to save people money, and you can target that tool to the people who need it the most. So a large part of my background and all my Canadian family is in Nova Scotia, and there is this amazing energy efficiency utility in that province called Efficiency, Nova Scotia, that, or Efficiency One now, but previously Efficiency Nova Scotia, um, where they have dedicated programs that go into low income communities, that go into renter communities, and help those households reduce their energy consumption and save money on their energy bills. So that's one. And the other one we can think about is how we allow communities that are currently marginalized in our economic system to profit from the renewable energy revolution, whether that profit is in like hard financial terms, so they're actually going to make some money from it, or in reducing embedded energy costs in those communities. So here in Canada, we actually already see that about 20% of renewable energy projects are owned by and operating in Indigenous communities. And that's huge and exciting because those communities have often run on, their energy systems are often run on very expensive energy sources like diesel that are very polluting and unhealthy for those communities. And often those communities don't have access to the same kinds of economic opportunities as others. And so seeing Indigenous communities really lead the charge on renewable energy development in Canada is exciting because it's bringing prosperity into those communities. It's bringing energy autonomy to those communities. It's giving them something that they can be training community members to do, so it's job creating. So that's another one. And then I'll give one other example. In California, we have this really interesting model where when they introduced their cap and trade system, their carbon pricing system, they said, we're going to take a portion of the money that we get from this carbon pricing system, and we are going to make sure that lower income households throughout California have solar panels on their roofs. And we're going to pay for that to happen. And those households in those communities, instead of now getting a check, so here in Canada, our carbon pricing system sends a check to everyone across the country, and that's useful. But in California, we see this model where it's like, instead of getting a check, I have an energy source embedded into my house at no cost to me that substantially lowers my household energy costs. And so maybe I'm not getting a check every month, but my energy costs every month are eliminated. And so I have much more income at my disposal because I'm not spending that income on energy. And that, I think, is a really powerful model that it would be interesting to think through applying here in Canada. How do we use some of this revenue that we're getting from carbon pricing to make sure that we're addressing energy affordability in the communities that need that?
I'm sure you're aware there's an incredible amount of momentum around net zero pledges in the public sector, governments from around the world, and the private sector as well. What are your thoughts around these net zero commitments from organization? Is it spin or substance?
Net zero by 2050 isn't putting action off until 3 decades from now. Net zero by 2050 requires concerted action planning activity that starts right now, ideally that started a decade ago, and continues on every day between now and 2050.
Canada comes in for criticism for its weak follow-up so far on carbon targets. What do you say to Canadians who are skeptical about sufficient action not being taken fast enough?
Your skepticism is warranted, first of all. Yeah, I mean, it's so unfortunate, right? Canada's really never met a climate target it couldn't miss. We've been setting climate targets since the early 1990s. We haven't met a single one at this point. I'm really hoping that we can correct for that trend by using tools that we now have at our disposal through things like Bill C-12, the Net Zero Accountability Act, which is a relatively new piece of legislation, just about a year old in Canada, that brings some consistency and some transparency to the climate planning process in Canada. Because this is part of the problem in this country. Our climate planning has been totally ad hoc so far, right? So we get a government that maybe cares about climate change. Maybe they make a commitment on climate emissions reductions. Maybe they follow through with that commitment. Maybe we hear about how they're doing. Instead, we need this piece of legislation that tells us, okay, every 5 years, you're going to set a target. By the time you set a target, you have to produce a plan to meet that target within 6 months. Here's the external expert group that's going to review your plans, going to review your progress, make sure you're on track, make recommendations for how to course correct if you're not, make recommendations for how to improve policy, find new opportunities to address emissions while continuing to grow the economy. And this is the model that we've seen employed in other jurisdictions that have been more successful in meeting their climate targets, like the UK. So I feel buoyed by the fact, and I was a big part of the fight to get Bill C-12 passed. It's not perfect, but I think it's a really huge improvement in Canada's climate planning process. So I think we can feel buoyed by that. That being said, governments across the board have been failing us, have been failing their populations on delivering the scale of ambition that's required to meet this crisis. And I think the thing that we have to do as individuals, if we are feeling concern and despair about that, is we have to activate as political citizens and demand from our political decision makers that they deliver on that scale of action. And I think that's maybe something that we're just coming to here in Canada. Unfortunately, climate change has been a rather politically polarized conversation in this country so far, but we're finally getting to a place where every party, regardless of their political identity, understands the climate crisis is a serious issue and they have to address it. And they need to be hearing from their voters that their vote is going to be cast according to whether that party is doing what it takes to address this crisis. So I would say that's it. Like, let's have those legislative frameworks in place. Let's make sure they're working. Let's make sure, we're engaging the independent expertise that we need to assess that. And let's, as a constituency, as concerned citizens in this country, let us demand from our political decision makers that they take the action that's required.
Okay, Catherine. To accelerate success, what other countries should Canada be looking to emulate or to learn from?
There are lessons that I think we can learn from so many places, and likewise, there are a lot of other places I think can learn from us, right? We also have some good expertise to be sharing at this point. But I mentioned the UK earlier. I think we've really turned to the UK a lot to help us think through this new piece of legislation, because the UK was the first to pass climate accountability legislation way back in 2008. And so they've really helped to model that system for the rest of the world. And there are now close to 30 jurisdictions around the world that have very similar systems, actually. So we just saw at COP26 in Glasgow in November that a consortium, now a global consortium of independent climate expert bodies has been created to help continue this dialogue around how we actually hold countries accountable for their climate commitments. So that's, I think, a good one. And we can also keep looking to the UK for how we detach our our economic growth, our GDP, from greenhouse gas emissions, because they have been incredibly successful in doing that in the UK. And that has been a big part of how they have been able to fulfill their climate commitments. They successfully decoupled their GDP from GHGs. And we are kind of approaching that point in Canada, but we need to kind of surpass it and make sure that our economic prosperity is not tied to increasing emissions. And that, I think, has maybe been a bit of a challenge for a country like Canada that is traditionally very natural resource based and very oriented toward exploiting and exporting those natural resources, which tends to be very carbon intensive. So that economic transformation piece, how are we diversifying our economy? How are we investing in those sectors that are going to deliver prosperity? And we often think about those sectors as like renewable energy. So we do this like we're moving from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy. So all the new prosperity and all the new jobs are going to be in renewable energy. But we can also think about sectors like the care economy, hospitals, nurses, long-term care facilities. Those are generally low carbon industries, right? And we know that we need to invest in them on the heels of the COVID-19 crisis. So we can be investing there. And of course, what that all comes along with is this question of just transition. How are we taking care of people and communities as we engage in this economic transformation? And there are really cool lessons that we can learn from other jurisdictions there, like Scotland. They have done some really amazing work uh, with just transition as they move away from coal. Similarly, in South Africa, we actually, again at COP26 in Glasgow, saw this $8.5 billion deal struck with South Africa between a number of other countries, the US, the EU, Germany, to support their just transition away from coal dependence. So I think we can also be looking to these other examples of economic diversification and just transition in parts of the world to inform the really necessary economic transition that we need to undertake here in Canada and the planning for that.
In Canada, where do you see the biggest opportunity to reduce greenhouse emissions in nature? And where do you see the biggest opportunity in technology?
Yeah, so we have talked about this a little bit already. I think those agricultural opportunities are really huge here in Canada. What we haven't really talked about is the devastation that we are seeing wrecked in our natural ecosystems, particularly in forests across Canada. And it's actually hard for me not to get really emotional when I think about it. Um, and we have really seen, I think many Canadians, if they think about climate change, if they think about carbon sources and sinks in Canada, they assume that our forests are carbon sinks. And in fact, that has not been the case for several years now. Our forests in Canada have really turned from carbon sinks, places that can store greenhouse gas emissions, to carbon sources. And that is largely because of ongoing deforestation and the devastating impacts of climate change that bring forest fires, that bring more extreme weather events, and that also bring pests like the pine beetle. I think a big part of where we need to be focusing our energy right now in Canada um, is figuring out how to reverse that trend, how to protect our forests, how to restore them, and unnecessary deforestation. And you know, I think a really groundbreaking report that came out this year was on Indigenous stewardship of lands and how much lands that are stewarded by Indigenous peoples around the world, they really outperform lands that are stewarded by settler populations in terms of carbon sink potential and biodiversity protection. And so I think actually a big part of the solution on the forest front here in Canada is increasing the amount of forests that are stewarded by Indigenous communities. So that's on the nature front. In terms of carbon reduction potential in technologies or in the industrial sector, you know, the big elephant in the room in Canada is our oil and gas sector. It's the largest and fastest growing source of emissions in the country. It's responsible for over a quarter of emissions in Canada outweighs any other sector in the country. And while we have been actually seeing significant emissions reductions in other sectors, the Canadian electricity sector has reduced its emissions over 30% in the last couple of decades, right? So, we've been seeing decarbonization happen. It hasn't been happening as fast as it needs to, but it has been happening in electricity and buildings and transportation. Well, not so much in transportation. I'll take that again. We have been seeing decarbonizing. It hasn't been happening as fast as it needs to, but it has been happening in the electricity system, in the building system. Meanwhile, we really haven't seen that happening in the oil and gas sector. In fact, emissions from the oil and gas sector have increased exponentially in the last 15 years. And so there's a huge potential for emissions reductions in that sector. And a lot of it involves methane reduction by applying technologies that we have that we know work right now, that can actually create jobs while we apply them, and thinking through how we address our production trends to reduce those emissions. And we actually have now a promise from the federal government to cap emissions in the oil and gas sector and set reduction targets every 5 years. So I think that's a really good move in the right direction.
Now, in your opinion, Catherine, what can governments learn from environmental advocacy and activism?
What can the government learn? I mean, obviously, so I think, like, what is it that you picture when you picture environmental advocacy and activism? Probably you picture people on the streets, right? The huge demonstrations that characterized the fall of 2019, when 500,000 people were on the streets of Montreal, and Greta Thunberg spoke to the crowd there. Um, Protests against fossil fuel infrastructure, the struggles that we're seeing in communities like Wet'suwet'en right now against the Coastal GasLink, the community really trying to protect their traditional territory and say no to more fossil fuel infrastructure. So I think that's really what comes to mind a lot of the time. But in fact, environmental advocacy and activism has a huge diversity of tactics associated with it, right? So there are a lot of really brilliant people who are also thinking through some of these creative solutions that we need to these tricky problems that we have to solve to address the climate crisis. So a lot of what governments can learn from environmental advocacy and activism is actually like really practical hands-on ideas for how we tackle this crisis. But maybe I'll take this answer in a different direction and say that part of what we can learn is action in the midst of despair. Um, I think we often ask ourselves, like, how do we have hope when we're seeing the escalating impacts of the climate crisis, when we're watching the people we love and the places that we cherish be so hurt by climate change? How do we, in the face of that kind of despair, respond? How do we have hope? People talk about hope all the time. But what I often say is, the antidote to despair is not hope, it's action. And the environmental community is all about action. That's really what calls a lot of us to this work, is the desire to stand in the face of despair, stand in the face of these devastating climate impacts, and do everything we can to mitigate some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis and figure out how we can build resilience in communities against those impacts. So I think maybe that's the thing that I would hand to governments, is to say, we all need to be in this together. That is the spirit of the environmental movement, and we need to be taking action despite the challenge, despite the scale of the crisis, despite the despair we might be feeling. And in fact, that action is what helps us pull ourselves out of that feeling of despair.
Is there an organization, activist, or movement that is inspiring you?
This has been my entire career working in this space, and I wouldn't have been able to make it my career if I didn't feel inspired every day by my colleagues and the amazing community that I get to be a part of. So it's hard to name any one organization or any one movement. I will say that I am so continuously blown away and touched by the fierce and unrelenting advocacy we see from young people. Um, so we've seen the school strike groups, Fridays for Future, and young people mobilizing in various configurations to demand a livable future for themselves and their children. And and that is, I think, something that gives a lot of us, that lifts up a lot of us and gives us a lot of energy to continue our work. Because really, I was reading this Twitter thread the other day, and the author said, we are fighting because our future is shrinking. And it was it resonated so much to hear that. It's true, right? I think for a lot of young people, the possibilities that they envision for themselves in the future are getting smaller and smaller. And we, as a society, as a species, we need to be thinking about how we expand that future again, how we invest right now to make sure that the people who are alive after you and I are gone have all of the options, all of the rich life that we have been able to explore. So yeah, maybe I'll say that is that I feel inspired by so many organizations, by so much of the movement, and the passion, the intelligence that's coming from young people right now is giving, I think, a lot of us a lot of strength.
Okay, Catherine, how about you close us off with some rapid fire questions? Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Now, Catherine, what is your favorite word?
Why? It's my favorite word, my favorite question, and I'm happy that I really hope I never stop asking it.
Now, what is one thing you can't live without?
Maybe I'll say my dog friend, Pico. He's my constant companion, and I wouldn't want to live without him.
Okay. What is something that challenges you?
I feel challenged by the reluctance that we see from governments to take action. I feel challenged by that all the time. And we are constantly being told we have the solutions we need, we have the technologies, and the one thing standing in our way is political will. So I feel challenged by that, and that challenge is what brings me to work every day.
Now, if you could have one superpower, what would it be?
This is a really important question. I've often said that my superpower would be to find the funnest party wherever I am, always. Uh, but I think I'm actually pretty good at that already. So maybe I would say that I would love to have the power to apparate. So I would love to be able to just appear wherever I wanted to, whenever I wanted to.
If you could turn back time and talk to your 18-year-old self, what would you tell her?
I would tell her that she's on the right track, and that her future is not going to look maybe exactly as she pictured it, but that her instinct to really give back to her community and invest in the people around her is going to lead her in the right direction.
And lastly, Catherine, what do you currently find most interesting in your world, in your sector?
That's a really good one. So here's the thing. I actually think a lot of the time my world and my sector is characterized by kind of like cynicism. And certainly a lot of us bring some cynicism to the mix. It's hard not to, given the state of the world. But I would say there's actually this interesting renewed optimism in my world right now, particularly on the heels of COP26. And that's because it really does seem like the conversation is shifting. And we're starting to talk about the real things right now. We're getting down to it. And a big part of that is actually that we're talking seriously about the energy transition, finally. Because this energy transition is the thing that's going to unlock our ability to address the climate crisis. And we need to accelerate that global energy transition. The final plenary at COP26, all the countries of the world together in a room, it was a debate. It was an hours long debate about the energy transition. And that's huge because we actually haven't seen as much direct talk about energy at COPs in the past. So that's an interesting thing that's going on. I think a lot of us are actually feeling a little more hopeful that we're finally having this real talk. So let's make sure it gets us to where we need to go.
Well, Catherine, this is it. We've reached the end of another episode of the Think Energy podcast. Truly loved and enjoyed our conversation today. If our listeners want to learn more about you and your organization, how can they connect?
I've just started a pretty new organization called Destination Zero, And you can find us as destinationzero.earth. That website's in development, but you'll have a landing page right there that gives you my contact information. And on Twitter, I'm at Kat Abreu, ABREU _.
Again, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you had a lot of fun.
I really did. Thanks so much, Daniel.
Thanks for tuning in for another episode of the ThinkEnergy podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you're listening. And to find out more about today's guest or previous episodes, visit ThinkEnergyPodcast.com. I hope you'll join us again next time as we spark even more conversations about the energy of tomorrow.